At exactly 7:15 a.m. on a crisp Monday morning, I discovered my prized 1972 Plymouth Barracuda was missing from my driveway. At first, I thought I was seeing things. That vivid orange paint job and its low-slung silhouette had been my pride and joy for more than a decade. It was no small car, and certainly not one you could misplace or fail to notice. Yet as sure as the sun rose that morning over Willow Creek Estates, my beloved Cuda had vanished. I stood in my driveway, coffee mug trembling in my hand, scanning the street from left to right. No broken glass, no suspicious tire marks, just a faint patch of oil I recognized from the Barracuda's old engine. If it had been stolen, there should have been some telltale sign of forced entry or a broken lock. Instead, the driveway looked too neat, as if someone had neatly swept away any evidence. I've lived in Willow Creek Estates for 8 years. The name sounds idyllic, doesn't it? Quaint houses on symmetrical lots, picket fences, a neatly manicured park with duck ponds. More retirees than you'd find at the local bingo hall. But at 54, I fit right in. The entire neighborhood was governed by a homeowners association, HOA, that took its rules far more seriously than any town council I'd encountered. And I would know something about councils and ordinances because I'm the chief of police in Maplewood, our county seat a few miles away. But here's the kicker. No one in Willow Creek Estates knew I was their chief of police. I had intentionally kept a low profile. It wasn't exactly a secret, but it also wasn't something I went out of my way to flaunt. I left my squad car and uniform business at the station. At home, I was simply Mitchell Barnes, the unassuming single guy in a brown ranch house on Maple Leaf Drive. My neighbors typically saw me in jeans, t-shirts, and an old baseball cap. It was an arrangement that suited me. I could relax without the pressure and scrutiny that came with my badge. Yet that Monday morning, as I stared at my empty driveway, the lines between my private life and my professional one began to blur in the most unexpected way. I first suspected theft, of course. Old muscle cars draw attention from collectors and thieves alike. But I heard no squealing tires in the night. My neighbor, Doug, was the sort who'd call 911 if a squirrel looked at him funny. Surely, if something suspicious had happened, he would have been the first to blow the whistle. So I walked over to his place, hoping for some insight. Doug answered the door in a plaid robe, hair sticking out in all directions. "Morning, Mitch," he said groggily. "You look rattled. Everything okay? Did you hear or see anything last night?" I asked, rubbing the back of my neck. "My Barracuda's gone." His eyes widened. "Gone? As in stolen?" "That's my question, too. You didn't notice anything?" Doug shook his head emphatically. "Not a peep. Even the neighborhood's usual owl was quiet." "Are you sure you didn't park it somewhere else?" I offered a forced laugh, as if I'd misplace a giant classic muscle car on a whim. "No, it was definitely there last night. I washed it around 7, then watched some TV before bed. This morning, poof." Doug whistled low. "That's wild. Maybe you should ask the HOA. You know they've been on a spree of random citations. Just last week, they threatened to fine me for leaving my recycling bin out 5 minutes too long." I remembered the occasional warnings I'd gotten from the HOA. They'd once criticized my lawn for being unkempt after I skipped a single weekend of mowing. I did get a letter about my car, too. Something about the bright orange color being a visually disruptive element. That letter had left me rolling my eyes. But they wouldn't actually, could they have had it towed? "Thanks, Doug," I said, forcing a polite smile and trying to mask the dread forming in my gut. "I'll check with them." I made my way to the HOA's administrative office, a small building next to the community pool. It was far too early for anyone to be there, so I settled for calling the main number. As expected, I got the dreaded, chirpy answering machine. "Thank you for calling Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Our office hours are from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. Monday through Friday. Leave a message or feel free to visit our website for more information." Fighting off a surge of impatience, I left a curt message explaining my car was missing and that I suspected it may have been towed under some misguided directive. Then I paced around my living room, trying to calm my mind. Years on the police force had taught me how to maintain composure, but when it's your own property on the line, especially one as dear to you as a classic you've spent years restoring, your blood pressure spikes in a hurry. By the time the HOA office finally opened, I was practically vibrating with nerves. I dialed them again, this time expecting an actual person. Sure enough, a bright, perky voice came through the line. "Hello, Willow Creek Estates HOA. How may I help you?" "This is Mitchell Barnes," I said, focusing on keeping my voice even. "I live at 327 Maple Leaf. My 1972 Plymouth Barracuda vanished from my driveway sometime last night. I have reason to believe your office may have had something to do with it." An awkward pause. Then came a reply, "Yes, Mr. Barnes. We followed standard procedure for vehicles that violate HOA guidelines. You should have received prior warnings." My stomach twisted into knots. I'd gotten the usual nasty letter about the color and the noise potential, but nothing indicating they had the right to remove it from my property without due process. "So you towed it?" "Actually, we sold it." My mouth went dry. "What did you just say?" She cleared her throat with a nervous cough. "The HOA seized and sold the vehicle at a small community auction. The sale was conducted on Thursday. We delivered a final notice to your mailbox, but it was never acknowledged. The buyer picked up the car last night." A headache roared to life behind my eyes. "You sold my car," I repeated, hardly believing the words. "Without so much as a personal call or a knock on my door?" The woman tried to stutter out an explanation. Something about not having my phone number on file, which I knew was nonsense. Everyone had my number, especially the local HOA. By the end, I felt the flush of anger creeping up my neck. But the real irony hadn't even hit them yet. That old Barracuda, with all its sentimental and monetary value, belonged to me, Mitchell Barnes, the chief of police. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I never felt my pulse pound quite like that while off duty. Usually, I was the level-headed one, the first person to calm a tense situation. But the HOA's audacity lit a fuse inside me. After I hung up with the office, I stared at the phone for a good minute, letting the enormity of what had happened sink in. They had sold my Barracuda at some ill-advertised auction, citing multiple violations. I was well aware the local statutes gave HOAs some latitude to tow or remove vehicles if they were in disrepair or truly abandoned. But my car was in pristine condition, never abandoned, and parked in my own driveway. Over the years, I'd put more into restoring that muscle car than some folks put into remodeling an entire kitchen. I phoned my attorney, Jerry Franklin, a longtime friend who'd helped me through a few real estate headaches in the past. "Jerry," I said, voice shaking, "how quickly can you get me an injunction to reverse a sale?" He perked up with immediate concern. "That depends on the circumstances, but you've got my attention." "What's going on?" I explained the gist. The Willow Creek HOA apparently decided my car was in violation of some arcane rule, gave minimal notice, then auctioned it off to some unknown buyer. Jerry nearly choked on his coffee. "That's insane. Even HOAs can't just unilaterally sell your property. They have to follow due process, which includes sending official notice with enough time to respond, plus a hearing if you dispute it." "Exactly. I never got any hearing notice, and I've only seen those worthless form letters they send out about fines. My guess is they rely on fear and confusion, banking on folks not challenging them. Problem is, they picked the wrong driveway this time." Jerry sighed heavily. "All right, Mitchell, I'll draft something. We'll need to move fast. Once a property changes hands, it can complicate the chain of ownership. You know how it goes." I knew all too well. By the time these things wound through the courts, who knew what shape my CUDA would be in, or who would be driving it? The mental image of some clueless buyer taking a joyride in my precious baby was almost too much to bear. I got in my regular SUV and drove straight to the HOA office, determined to do some investigating on my own. The office was a drab, single-story building with beige siding and blinds that always seemed drawn. There was a single occupant behind a desk, a bespectacled woman in a knit sweater that looked 3 sizes too large. She was no more than 30, yet she carried the vibe of a high school librarian who'd rather be alone with her books. She perked up as I entered, then visibly shrank when I approached the desk. Mr. Barnes?" "That's me," I said, forcing a cordial smile. "I need every piece of paperwork associated with the sale of my car." Immediately, she shifted in her seat, carefully adjusting her glasses. I only have what's in our database." Our board members handle the final approvals. Then show me what you have. She winced, tapping nervously on her keyboard. I rested my forearms on the counter, scanning the deserted lobby. A single pot of dusty silk flowers sat on a chipped end table, overshadowed by a bulletin board plastered with outdated event flyers. Garden Club meets every second Tuesday. Bingo night fundraiser. Trivia night canceled. Nothing about a vehicle auction. When the woman finally printed out the documents, I scanned them. It was a scant handful of forms. A notice of violation, claiming my car's color was too bright and disruptive, and that it posed a nuisance to neighbors. A generic final notice, referencing a community bylaw that allowed removal of property in ongoing violation if unresolved for a period of 60 days or more. Some slip of a public auction announcement dated 2 days prior. The kicker? The bylaw number was one typically reserved for things like abandoned boats or broken-down RVs that become health hazards. My Barracuda was hardly abandoned or hazardous. "This is it?" I asked, voice tight. She nodded. "I'm sorry, Mr. Barnes. That's everything I have on file." I pressed on. "So who's the board member in charge of enforcement?" "That would be Mr. Nielsen, our acting board president. He also heads the enforcement committee." "Where can I find him?" She fidgeted again. "It doesn't really have official office hours here, but he might be at the golf course around noon." The golf course. Of course. Willow Creek's self-important board members spent half their days golfing. I glanced at my watch. It was just past 11. If I hurried, I might catch him. Before leaving, I demanded a signed statement confirming the documents in my hand were complete and accurate. The woman begrudgingly complied, no doubt rattled by my intensity. I left with a folder tucked under my arm, determined to get answers out of Mr. Nielsen. On the drive over, I wondered if this had been a personal vendetta. I never had more than a passing conversation with Nielsen, but I knew his type. Pressed polo shirts, attitude of entitlement, and an obsession with keeping the neighborhood's property values up. Perhaps he saw my bright orange Barracuda as a threat to the community's bland, conformist look. I pulled up to the Willow Creek Golf and Country Club, a place so pretentious they required collared shirts just to eat at their snack bar. Sure enough, I spotted a tall, lanky figure in a baby blue polo shirt practicing a swing on the driving range. Even from a distance, I recognized the stoic posture of the HOA's fearless leader. I walked across the manicured lawn, ignoring a club attendant who said something about membership. Nielsen caught sight of me mid-swing, sending a golf ball slicing far off to the left. He frowned at me like I was the reason for his poor stroke. "Mr. Barnes," he said, letting the club rest on his shoulder. "I gather this isn't a social visit?" "Not even close," I replied. "Your office says you're responsible for the sale of my car. I want an explanation, and I want to know how you justified this under the HOA's bylaws." Nielsen's face hardened. He gestured for me to step aside. "Let's not make a scene on the range," he said. "We can speak by the caddy's shack." We moved a few yards away, the smell of fresh grass and a faint whiff of fertilizer in the air. I resisted the urge to clamp my hands into fists. I needed to keep my composure, even if my insides were roiling. Nielsen sighed, adopting a condescending tone. "Look, Mr. Barnes, the board has been receiving complaints about that loud, bright vehicle of yours for months now. We have strict aesthetic guidelines for vehicles parked in open view. We gave you ample time to correct the issue, and we received no acknowledgement. It was well within our rights to seize and auction it." "That's nonsense," I spat, waving the documents in front of him. "I got a couple of letters, but nowhere did it say you'd forcibly sell my property if I didn't repaint it. And all of this is legally questionable at best." He shrugged, swiping an invisible speck of dust off his polo. "You can take it up with the association's legal counsel if you wish, Mr. Barnes. The sale is final." He probably expected me to stomp away in defeat, maybe even whimper. He had no idea I dealt with unscrupulous characters for a living. Nor did he know he'd just sold the personal property of a sitting chief of police. This wouldn't be a matter of a polite lawsuit or a whimpering complaint. This was a matter of law. "All right, Mr. Nielsen," I said, my voice steady. "I'll be in touch." And with that, I turned and left him to his precious golf game, my mind already spinning with the next steps. If the HOA believed they could browbeat me into compliance, they were in for a rude awakening. Their petty power play had just become the biggest headache they'd ever unleashed, and they still had no idea who they'd tangled with. I spent the remainder of that Monday studying every word of Willow Creek Estate's bylaws. They were dense, riddled with legalese. But once you got past the formal language, the central point was clear. The association could only seize a nuisance vehicle if it was left derelict or if repeated attempts at resolution were ignored for more than 6 months. Moreover, residents had the right to request a formal hearing within 30 days of the first notice. The fact I received no hearing invitation was a glaring omission, one they likely hoped I'd never question. My mind was already drafting the complaint we would file in court. But I also knew these cases could drag on, especially if the HOA played dirty. In the meantime, I wanted to find out who purchased my car and how quickly we could get it back, preferably before any damage was done to it. Jerry called me in the early afternoon with a status update. "I've got a judge who might expedite a preliminary injunction," he told me. "But I can't promise anything until we're on the docket. We might get lucky if the judge sees this as an unlawful taking." "Any chance of a more immediate measure?" I asked. "Short of your good standing in the community or making some kind of formal complaint with your own department?" "Not really. But I assume you'd like to keep your personal life out of the tabloids." He wasn't wrong. The last thing I wanted was a news story reading Chief of Police in Neighborhood feud over classic CR. Even if it vindicated me, it invited a swirl of media interest that could complicate my work and my personal life. That night, I tried to unwind on my porch, nursing a glass of iced tea. The late summer breeze was pleasant, carrying the chirp of crickets and the occasional hum of a distant lawnmower. I wondered if Nielsen or anyone else from the HOA was lurking behind their curtains, watching my reaction. Paranoia wasn't my usual stance, but I'd seen enough bizarre behavior in my years on the force to suspect pettiness was behind all of this. The next day, I decided to use my resources more directly. I went into my office at the police station, just another day as Chief Barnes. I strolled past my administrative assistant, Angela, who gave me the usual morning nod. Inside my office, I fired up the computer and pulled up the Department of Motor Vehicles database. Normally, I'd refrain from using departmental resources for personal matters, but this was a special circumstance. It was, after all, my car, and it had effectively been stolen under the flimsiest of pretenses. I typed in the VIN from memory. I knew every digit of that car's identity. My heart pounded as I waited for the system to load the updated registration record. If the buyer had immediately re-registered it, I'd see a new name. Sure enough, the system showed a brand new transfer of title to someone named Brian Gutierrez. The address listed was in the next county over, about 40 minutes away. The transaction had been processed the previous day, meaning the buyer wasted no time slapping on new plates. I jotted down Brian's address. Possibly, the poor guy had no idea the auction was questionable. He might have simply walked in looking for a bargain, then found my Barracuda. Still, I needed to speak with him. Before I left, I checked the clock. 8:30 in the morning, plenty of time to get a drive in. I told Angela I'd be out on a personal matter and hopped back into my SUV. The route took me past farmland and a few small communities. The more I drove, the more anxious I became. My imagination conjured horrifying images of the Barracuda stripped for parts, or worse, repainted. I clenched the steering wheel, tried to remind myself that not everyone was a malicious crook. Most likely, Brian was just a classic car enthusiast who got an incredible deal. Eventually, I pulled onto a winding gravel driveway leading to a modest, single-story house. No sign of the Barracuda out front, but there was a detached garage. As I parked, I spotted a man in his early 30s stepping out onto the porch. Tall, bearded, wearing a well-worn t-shirt with a vintage car logo on it. He raised an eyebrow as I climbed out of my SUV. "Can I help you?" he asked, crossing his arms in a guarded stance. I approached with my hands visible at my sides, quickly flashing my Maplewood police badge. "Morning. I'm Chief Mitchell Barnes. I'm here about a Plymouth Barracuda that was sold to you at an HOA auction." Confusion flickered across his features. "Oh yeah, I did buy a Barracuda," he said slowly. Is there a problem? I offered a measured nod. I'm afraid there might be. That car was sold without my permission. It was seized illegally by the Willow Creek Estates, HOA. He let out a low whistle. You're serious? Wow. I got it for a steal. They listed it for a fraction of what it's worth. I figured the owner was having financial trouble or something. No, I said firmly. No financial trouble. I wasn't even aware it was being put up for auction until after the fact. Brian shook his head, rubbing his beard with one hand. That's messed up. I had no idea. The woman who ran the auction, some lady from the HOA, said it was all legit. Even had paperwork. I paid cash. I'm not accusing you of wrongdoing, I assured him. You didn't know, but that car is still legally mine, as far as I'm concerned. And I'd like to get it back. Did they give you a title? He nodded. Signed by a representative of the HOA, but I haven't tried to question it. The DMV let me register it. Didn't see any red flags. Do you still have it here? I asked, carefully measuring my words. Brian sighed, motioning toward the garage. It's in there. I was planning on doing a tune-up. He led me inside, where I finally laid eyes on my Barracuda again. My chest tightened with relief. The car looked untouched, still the blazing orange, still with my custom leather seats. As I walked around it, I fought the urge to reach out and hug the fender. Look, Brian said, his voice sympathetic, I'm a car guy too. If the HOA scammed you, I don't want to be part of that. But I did pay good money for this. I need to at least recoup my investment. Of course, I agreed. If it comes down to it, my attorney can handle reimbursements. I just want my car back. For now, I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't do any major modifications. I'm filing a lawsuit against the HOA, and I need the car in the state it was in when they took it. Brian rubbed the back of his neck. That's fair. I can hold off. But keep me posted, okay? I'm not looking to get into a legal battle. I'm just a guy who loves old muscle cars. I handed him my card. I'll keep you in the loop. Thank you for cooperating. And again, I'm sorry you got dragged into this. Leaving his place, I felt a surge of optimism. My car was safe for now, but it was also a stark reminder of how brazen the HOA's actions had been. If they were willing to violate my rights in such a blatant way, how many other residents had they bullied? The fact that I was the chief of police, and they didn't even know it, made the irony cut deeper. By the time I got back into town, I had a new clarity. This fight wasn't just about my Barracuda. It was about holding Willow Creek Estates HOA accountable for their overreach. And that meant I needed to step out of the shadows, let them see exactly who I was, and demand they face the consequences. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for that Friday evening. Ordinarily, these meetings were sleepy affairs, with a handful of gray-haired residents bickering about lawn heights and barking dogs. This time, though, word had spread about the fiasco with my Barracuda. Apparently, the story had leaked. Doug told me that a few neighbors saw the car being loaded onto a flatbed late at night, and the rumor mill churned at full speed. By the time I arrived at the community center, a small crowd had gathered outside. They parted as I approached, greeting me with a mix of curiosity and sympathy. I overheard snippets of conversation. I heard they sold Mitch's car behind his back. If they can do that to him, what's stopping them from towing my RV? The board's gone too far this time. Inside the hall, the HOA board was seated behind a folding table. There was Nielsen, the board president, looking unruffled as always. Flanking him were two middle-aged women in business casual attire, and next to them, a bald man in a sweater vest who kept smoothing his tie nervously. A modest microphone setup was positioned at the center of the table for public comments. Nielsen cleared his throat and began the meeting with procedural formalities, calling the roll, approving minutes from the last session. He attempted to maintain an air of business as usual, but it was obvious from the tension in the room that no one was there to discuss routine maintenance. Then came the agenda item, vehicle aesthetic compliance. Nielsen leaned into the microphone. We have had ongoing concerns regarding the consistent enforcement of the association's guidelines on vehicles. As many of you are aware, certain bright or excessively modified vehicles can negatively impact the community's image. Our enforcement committee has the authority to levy fines or, in extreme cases, remove vehicles deemed in violation. He paused, glancing at me for a moment, then continued with a thin smile. I understand there have been questions about the recent enforcement action taken against one resident's vehicle. Let it be known that the proper steps were followed. I raised my hand, and the audience's chatter hushed. Nielsen's mouth snapped shut. He forced a stiff smile. Yes, Mr. Barnes? I stood, moving to the microphone. My heart thumped, but in that moment, my years of public speaking as chief gave me the confidence I needed. Thank you, Mr. Nielsen. I began, voice echoing. I'm here to address the matter of my 1972 Plymouth Barracuda, which was seized and sold without my permission. I have reviewed the bylaws you cited. I did not receive a formal hearing or an official final notice that would have allowed me to remedy the so-called violation. A few scattered "that's right" exclamations came from the crowd, along with some supportive nods. Furthermore, I continued, the bylaw you invoke pertains to abandoned or hazardous vehicles, which mine was not. It was legally registered in excellent condition and parked on my private property. This entire action reeks of an overreach of power, one that I will not allow to stand. Nielsen tried to maintain a placid expression, but I saw the twitch in his jaw. With all due respect, Mr. Barnes, you were mailed multiple notices. When those notices were ignored, we acted according to our guidelines. If you disagree, you have every right to file a complaint with our legal department. I let out a slow breath, then placed my police badge on a lectern, letting it catch the overhead lights. There was a collective gasp from the audience. My name is Mitchell Barnes, I said, voice reverberating. I'm a chief of police for the city of Maplewood. I've been living in this community for 8 years. I'm intimately familiar with the law, both local and state. And I can tell you, what you did was not legal. Murmurs spread through the crowd like wildfire, some people craning their necks to get a glimpse of my badge. Nielsen's confident mask cracked for a split second. His eyes darted sideways to the other board members. One of the women, Ms. Peterman, spoke up hesitantly. Chief Barnes, if we had known. But you didn't bother to know. I cut in, my voice calm but firm. You took my property without following due process. I have already contacted my attorney, and I am prepared to pursue every legal avenue to see this rectified and to ensure that the Willow Creek Estates HOA never again oversteps its authority in such a manner. The crowd erupted into a flurry of whispers and exclamations. Nielsen's face reddened, but he tried to rein it in. All right, folks, let's keep this orderly. He turned to me, forcing what looked like a smile. Chief Barnes, we will, of course, cooperate with any investigation. But let's remember, the HOA has the right to enforce its bylaws in order to maintain property values. I stared him down. Enforcing bylaws is one thing. Violating someone's fundamental property rights is another. Whether I'm chief of police or a retiree on a fixed income, the rules of due process apply. The tension in the room was electric. More than a few neighbors called out, "Hear, hear," or "That's the truth," or "Now you've done it, Nielsen." Just then, a trembling older woman stood up in the front row. Mr. Barnes isn't the only one, she said, voice quavering. Last year, they towed my nephew's old truck, said it was an eyesore. I paid them pound fees out of fear of being fined more. But it seems they've been pushing these rules beyond reason for quite a while. Another man rose up. I got penalized for having a boat in my driveway for 2 days when I was fixing the trailer hitch. They threatened to sell it if I didn't move it immediately. It was like a dam had burst. People began openly accusing the board of high-handed tactics, hidden fees, and intimidation. Suddenly, all eyes were on Nielsen and his committee. The board members exchanged panicked looks. Nielsen tapped the microphone repeatedly, trying to regain order. Let's everyone please calm down. The board will look into all these grievances, but we must follow standard procedure. We can't address every complaint on the spot. I stepped back to the mic for one final comment. I have filed for an injunction to reverse the sale of my car. I recommend that any other resident who feels wronged by this association do the same. And, in case there's any doubt, I will personally ensure that the Willow Creek Police Department reviews all relevant codes and any potential criminal wrongdoing in the unauthorized sale of private property. At that, Nielsen announced a sudden recess, apparently unable to keep a lid on the meeting any longer. The board members stood and hurried out a side door, leaving behind a roomful of angry residents. There was a shuffle of footsteps, a rising chatter of speculation. Some folks came over to shake my hand, thanking me for finally standing up to the HOA. I left the community center with a mix of triumph and apprehension. Triumph because I'd exposed their misconduct in front of a crowd, and I had the law on my side. Apprehension because HOAs often circle the wagons when challenged. Nielsen wouldn't give up easily, but at least now, everything was out in the open. No more playing nice, no more politely ignoring the letters in my mailbox. My car was in safe hands for the moment, and if the board tried to stall me, they'd discover just how persistent a police chief could be. Within a week, my lawsuit against the HOA was formally filed. Jerry was nothing if not efficient. We laid out the timeline of events. The initial notice, which was vague and misleading, the so-called auction, which gave me no realistic chance to respond, and the rush title transfer. We attached statements from neighbors who had received similarly dubious threats. That final detail was Jerry's idea. Showing a pattern of abuse was more compelling than a single incident. Meanwhile, Brian Gutierrez, the unwitting buyer, cooperated fully. He offered to appear in court if needed and even sent an affidavit affirming that the purchase process felt rushed and unorthodox, with the HOA representative pushing to finalize the sale quickly. He was more than happy to return the car once he got his payment back. The local press, always hungry for a good story, caught wind of the scandal. I dreaded the headlines, but they arrived anyway. Chief's classic car sold by HOA, read the Maplewood Chronicle. The article detailed how the Willow Creek Estates HOA might have overstepped their legal boundaries, complete with quotes from me, Jerry, and a few outraged residents. It didn't take long for this to trigger a frenzy of discussion on social media. Yet, despite the swirling controversy, I took some satisfaction in seeing the sense of camaraderie forming among residents. People I barely knew stopped me on the street to offer support or share their own HOA horror stories. A groundswell of dissatisfaction with the board was reaching a fever pitch. A special HOA meeting was called 2 weeks later. This time, not in the usual small community center, but at a larger venue nearby, due to the expected turnout. More than 100 residents packed into the local library's auditorium. The board members lined up at a table in front, each wearing that unmistakable expression of cornered animals. Nielsen, center stage, tried to maintain an air of authority, but the tension was palpable. I chose a seat in the third row, content to let the community speak first. And speak they did. Resident after resident took the microphone to recount how the HOA had harassed them over trivial matters. Tiny cracks in the driveway, a wreath on the door that was not seasonal enough, a kid's skateboard ramp in a backyard that wasn't visible from the street. Each complaint painted the board in a more oppressive light. Finally, the microphone came to me. I stood and cleared my throat. I think we've heard enough to conclude that these aren't isolated incidents. The Willow Creek HOA leadership has willfully misapplied rules and used intimidation to get its way. Now, I'm aware that not all HOAs are bad, but this board, under its current president, has crossed the line. I glanced around, seeing nods of agreement. When my car was seized and sold, it was more than just an inconvenience. It was a violation of basic property rights and an act carried out under a pretense of authority they didn't lawfully have. That is why my attorneys and I have taken legal action. In addition, I know that many of you are considering a recall of the current board. The mention of a recall election sent a ripple of excitement through the audience. A recall was a powerful tool. If enough residents voted, the current board members could be removed and replaced. It was an uncommon measure, but entirely legal under the association's bylaws. Nielsen's voice cut through the crowd, shaky but loud. All of you need to understand something. We did what we thought best for the community. If I overstepped, then yes, I apologize. But we must keep property values high and maintain a certain standard. Otherwise, Willow Creek becomes just another rundown neighborhood. Someone booed. Another person shouted, "We're not a rundown neighborhood. Stop hiding behind that excuse." Nielsen's face was flushed. He glared at me. "And as for you, Mr. Barnes, Chief Barnes, This personal crusade of yours has turned the community against its own leadership. I raised an eyebrow. The community is responding to your actions, Mr. Nielsen. Actions have consequences. What followed was a tense back and forth between the board and residents, culminating in a motion to hold a recall vote. The date was set for the following month. If the majority voted to oust the board, new elections would take place immediately. In the weeks leading up to that recall vote, my lawsuit gained traction. The HOA's attorney tried to negotiate, offering to buy me out, essentially paying me the value of the Barracuda to drop the matter. I refused. I wanted my car back, not hush money. We pressed forward. Finally, the recall election day arrived. Residents shuffled into the community center in a steady stream, each casting their ballot. By that evening, the results were in. An overwhelming 82% voted to remove Nielsen and his cronies from the board. A wave of relief and celebration swept through Willow Creek Estates as neighbors honked car horns and toasted each other on their porches. The new board, composed of people who campaigned on transparency and fair treatment, wasted no time in making amends. They passed a resolution acknowledging the wrongful seizure of my vehicle, promising to cooperate fully with the court's decision. Meanwhile, the judge in my case was quick to grant an injunction, returning the car's legal title to me and ordering the HOA to reimburse Brian Gutierrez for his purchase costs. On a breezy Saturday morning, Brian and I met in his driveway one last time. He gave me the keys, and I finally slid into the driver's seat of my Barracuda again. I started the engine, feeling that reassuring rumble of power beneath my feet. My throat tightened with emotion, relief, gratitude, and maybe a tinge of lingering anger that it ever came to this. But mostly gratitude. Brian patted the hood and said, "Glad it's going back to its rightful home, Chief. I'll always be a fan of this ride." I nodded, shaking his hand. "If I ever decide to sell it, legally this time, you'll be the first to know." We both laughed, a sense of camaraderie born from a bizarre deal. As I drove back into Willow Creek Estates, that orange Cuda turning heads as usual, I saw neighbors waving. Some whistled in approval, others clapped. My face warmed with a grin. The board that had tried to rid our neighborhood of anything they deemed too bright or unconventional was gone, replaced by a group that embraced a more balanced approach. Not long after, I received formal apologies from a few of the former board members, including Ms. Peterman. They claimed they'd been misled by Nielsen's aggressive stance on community image. I had no particular need to hold grudges. Let them learn from their mistakes. What truly mattered was that the neighborhood came together, demanded change, and got it. In the end, the HOA discovered, far too late, that the bright orange Barracuda they deemed an eyesore had actually belonged to the chief of police. But the moral of the story wasn't just about who owned the car. It was about the principle that no organization, however well-intentioned, has the right to trample over private property without due process. These days, Willow Creek Estates feels more like the peaceful haven I'd always hoped it would be. My driveway is once again graced by the presence of that classic muscle car. Occasionally, I'll drive it to the station, letting the new board know I'm still watching, ensuring they keep their promises. And every time I pass by that once oppressive HOA office, I can't help but smile at how one bright orange car, and the law behind it, turned the tide for an entire community. The end.